you very much. So also welcome from my side to this breakout session. My colleague Graham and we have the pleasure to chair this breakout session, and we hope you had a enjoyable lunch break. And now it's getting to interesting 3 presentations. We have 30 minutes per presentation, 20 minutes for the presentation itself, and then 10 minutes for questions and answers. And I think I have nothing more to say than giving the word to Mark Addis, our first speaker, who is hopefully coming back soon. Yes, there you are again. Hello, Mark Addis. So it's your stage.
Thank you very much. Right, well, today I'd like to talk about some work I've done jointly with Christopher Winch about autonomy and expertise in the English workplace. Now, as you'll see, this presentation is based on a published paper. So what I'd like to do today is to highlight some aspects of the published paper and the research it's derived from, in the hope of encouraging you to read the paper itself and to engage with myself and Chris to take this forward. So in terms of that, what I want to do today is to talk about autonomy and expertise in the workplace. And although both of those might sound rather abstruse and theoretical, as will become apparent in the talk, they connect up very directly with a lot of things that have been said in the conference already, particularly in relation to the keynotes. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what's the context of all this? Well, what we have here is a case of poor productivity and poor productivity growth in the English economy, inadequate and fragmentary vet provision in England, overemphasis on task-based skills, and now a focus of job specification in large sectors of the English economy. Now, all of that will be familiar, and I from early discussions in the conference, and particularly things you at Keep said. And also, I want to tie this up to something we might think of, to important findings we think about the psychology of work and employment, namely that lack of autonomy affects job satisfaction and performance. So what we wanted to do with this work really was to investigate both cultural issues around workplace training, the psychology of job satisfaction and professional development, and connect that to important economic issues about productivity and productivity growth. I mean, I'm not really going to say any more about the well-known problems of productivity and productivity growth. We all know how far the UK economy has stalled, how much productivity growth has fallen. And also, again, there's been extensive discussion today about how fragmentary vet provision is in the UK, and all the problems that are related to it being employer-led. And another thing that's come up in a lot of the discussion is how narrowly based a lot of the discussion of skills is, and how narrowly focused jobs are, where they become about performance of particular tasks rather than embedding work in a context of developing wider skills and generally progressing. Next. So the background to the research paper was a project called the Transformers Project, and this was research which was undertaken by myself and Christopher Winch, and it was in conjunction with what was the Association of Teachers and Lecturers and subsequently became the National Education Union, and it was funded by the now defunct Union Learn Fund. And what we did in the project, we wanted to explore the English context of employee-led skill development, and to see what some of the implications of that were. And we aimed to build connections between vocational educators and employers to support work-based learning. Because one of the things we thought was important is to identify those connections between providers of education and employers to give better quality training. And again, as we've seen earlier in the conference, that's a recurrent theme. And we identified and analysed a number of aspects of work-based learning, as will become clear when I discuss the questionnaire. And we emphasised highlighting the significant dependence between skills and training on workplace cultures and practices. Now, one thing that's important methodologically about this, and I think one which wouldn't be at all contentious in this conference, but might be contentious to economists, is what determines skills and training practice in the workplace isn't various kinds of economic theory, mostly microeconomic theory, but it's very much about workplace culture. It's very much sociological. So the emphasis on the project was beginning to understand some of the sociology and the culture. And we did that by a combination of what was a questionnaire, followed up by semi-structured interviews. Next. Now, this next slide highlights the transversal skills we're investigating in the project. And this particular diagram was done by a friend of one of the people on the project, and you'll recognise it as a London Underground version of transversal skills. But as you'll see, they're about things like planning, judgment, communication. Now, what you can see when you take all of those branches going out, they're all key for keeping the business on track in various respects. And the idea of all of these was to provide a nice visual of what they were, and for people to see how far along they were particular tracks. And what you'll see about transversal skills that's important is that they're cut across all kinds of work. That, regardless of your business, of your sector, you'll need to plan, communicate, judge, and organise. And this will become crucial when we come on to the more conceptual and theoretical part, because of what these have to do with autonomy. So the key thing about these is their general high-level cross-cutting skills. Next. So what did we get out of the Transformers project? Well, certainly, as you'll see from the research side, we got a lot of important insights. But organisations benefited considerably because it refreshed thinking in organisations about how do you recruit your workforce, how do you develop your workforce, how do you recruit and develop apprenticeships? Now, those are all actually important questions, because one of the things we found is often there was a very little systematic relationship between the qualifications that were nominally required for the job and the qualifications which people had. And the other thing we found out is that in terms of workforce development, there was virtually no systematic training, which again won't be a surprise given the discussions we've had earlier in the conference. But some of the things that we found out, Chris and I were amazed at, not in a good way. I mean, in some cases, the lack of stunning, the lack of engagement was very, very surprising, particularly, when they were smallish private companies who would have directly benefited from improved staff training. And certainly we also found with apprenticeships, there were a number of odd things going on. And although it was difficult to pin down, we were pretty sure in at least one or two cases that that apprenticeships were not being used in entirely the way they were intended to, and that older people were being put in to retrain as apprentices when the apprenticeship should have gone to younger people. So we also work with learning providers or in-house development and training teams, and we try to work innovatively in collaboration across sector networks. Certainly all of the organisations that work with us found it beneficial, and they engaged in follow-up semi-structured interviews. So we got a good amount of both quantitative and qualitative data. And as a result of our intervention, some of the organisations changed a number of their practices for the better, including delivering more training, giving pay rises and doing some restructuring. And if you have a look at the website for the Transformers project, you'll be able to see an example of some of the concrete outcomes that resulted from this work. Next. So onto the paper. So what this paper was designed to do was to fill an important gap, because there is virtually no literature on methodologies for measuring autonomy in the British workplace. And quite simply, what I mean by autonomy in this context is an ability to exercise a degree of freedom in how you effectively pursue your work. I mean, there are a lot of complex philosophical and theoretical discussions around that, but I'm not going to go into that here. So it was a new approach to measuring workplace autonomy using an application of the methodology to transform this project. Now, I'm going to explain a bit about how that works. And what we need to do for that is to look at a key distinction between skills required to perform particular types of tasks, that's a particular type specific thing, and transversal abilities, which are those higher level cross-cutting abilities which I referred to earlier and which were pictured on the diagram. Now, transversal abilities are both those generally encompassed by planning and individual ones such as communication, critical thinking, evaluation, problem solving, and teamwork. Now, if you think about this for a minute, you'll begin to see where this is going. Because if you're in a job where you have more autonomy, you're much more likely to be able to exercise a degree of freedom over how you plan your work generally, and particularly how you plan your communication, your critical thinking, your evaluation, your problem solving, your teamwork. And if you're in a job with much less autonomy, you'll have far less of that. And to sort of give you an example, if you think about the difference between someone, say, who is a university lecturer and the degree of control they have over their work, and someone who is working, say, in a fast food business, you can begin to see the difference. The benefit of this particular approach is it's practically usable, and it also links up nicely with occupational classifications. Next. Right, the other part of the theoretical approach is based on the difference between know that and know how. I mean, both Chris and I have written about this, and it's a very important distinction between know that, which is factual knowledge, and know how, which is knowing how to do things. And what Chris and I have been particularly interested in is the particular types of levels of know-how and their combinations within transversal abilities and project management. And what we really mean by that is when you're thinking about transversal abilities and project management, there's a lot of know-how involved in that. And we want to be able to find out and analyze the type of know-how that's involved. Because if you are going to be effectively, if you're going to effectively use transversal abilities and project manage, then you do have to have the right types of know-how to do that. So that's the connection. Next. Right, now what I want to do is to come on to how this connects up with some much broader theoretical issues. And this is really to provide some clear theoretical rationale for the paper and to explain why the methodology works in the way that it does. I mean, obviously here I've got one slide and I'm compressing what is very, very complex and sometimes contested stuff. But I think it would be fair to say everything down here is widely accepted. So expertise covers various kinds of practice, knowledge, attention-based skills, decision-making expertise, action planning, and the like. So in other words, it covers a whole range of things that you're able to do at a high level. And in that sense, I'm taking the use of expert for the one we normally understand it as, that it's some kind of specialized ability, really. Now, what we do know is that complex perceptual judgment and decision-making skills are widely agreed to be criteria for vocational expertise. So if you ask, does someone have vocational or practical expertise? One of the things that you want to know is, does that person read or understand situations correctly? Does that person exercise good judgment? Does that person have good decision-making skills? So for example, if you go and consult a lawyer and you talk to them, you would expect that the lawyer recognizes the legal problem, that they judge your problem appropriately, and they give you, a decision about, for example, whether you should go to court or not, or settle out of court, or whatever. I mean, if a lawyer didn't do any of those, you'd be left wondering whether they really were expert, or at least expert in law. What's important for us theoretically is exercising autonomy in the workplace is a prerequisite for the acquisition of these. So what we are saying here is if you are going to exercise complex perceptual judgment and decision-making skills, in order for you to do that, you have to have a certain degree of autonomy. And the conception of autonomy we have is very much more one which tends to come out of continental rather than analytic philosophy. And we take it that workplace agency is the formation and implementation of intentions over relatively extended periods. So in other words, it's about intentions over an extended period And this agency has manifested the ability to form and carry through projects involving planning and other transversal abilities. So agency essentially is about what you intend to do and how you carry it out. Next. Now, importantly, and this is explained in more detail in the paper, the conceptual approach to workplace autonomy taken here is that it is a reasonable proxy for and a measure it is to display transversal abilities. So what we argue is that if you want to find out how much workplace autonomy somebody has, a reasonable proxy for it is how much they display transversal abilities. And to go back to the previous example about the difference between a university lecturer and someone who works in a fast food business, a university lecturer has a lot of autonomy because they're able to display a wide range of transversal abilities that they have control over. Whereas if you take someone in a fast food business, their ability to exercise those transversal abilities and the extent to which they have control over that is very much restricted. We've tested this with a number of occupational classifications, and you can certainly try it for yourself, but all the evidence suggests today that if you try this against occupational classifications, it will reliably correlate workplace autonomy against transversal abilities. So all the evidence today suggests it's robust. Next slide. Okay, so conclusion. So the first conclusion is one I think that wouldn't surprise any of us so far, that worker agency, workplace autonomy and productivity are strongly related. And I think, again, discussions we've had elsewhere in the conference very much confirm that. There is a lot of scope for improving worker autonomy in the English workplace. Again, we've talked about a lot of people having no training, no development, and all of that is strongly correlated with a lack of development of autonomy. As has been argued here, the research established proof of concept for exploring a new approach to measuring workplace autonomy in the UK. And I would suggest we consider trialing this approach to increase workplace autonomy, improve vet and job redesign. So, I mean, I think if you use it, you can use it to improve autonomy in the workplace, you can use it to improve vocational education and training. It's also a useful tool for job redesign, because if you are engaged in job redesign, one of the things you want to know is, do you want to increase or decrease people's autonomy? And having a reliable tool to measure and evaluate, that's very useful. And finally, we come to a book. This is all very well and good, but it has been on the project a major challenge to engage employers and organisations with this kind of activity. There is a very urgent need for it, but equally there is a very big conceptual and sociological and motivational problem to get employers and organisations to engage with this. So collectively, all have a lot of work to do. And finally, I'd like to go to the references next. Well, if you're interested in this, I've already pointed you to the Transformers project website, and you can find a link to the paper. And if you click on that, you can download a copy. And if you're interested in the general sort of background and issues around that, please take a look at the book Chris and I co-edited called Education and Expertise, because that provides the background to many of these issues in this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Perfectly on time. So we have enough time to discuss for discussion. And if you have questions, you can please write it in the chat. I already saw that Graham has a question. Maybe you can just say it again.
Well, in terms of transversal ability, core skills, key competencies, I mean, this is one of the things I think that plagues this area, that there are frequently conceptual definitions which are both similar and different. I mean, certainly some of the transversal abilities will be like core skills and key competencies, but the reason we decided to call them transversal abilities is because of how it fits into the theoretical framework of knowing how and knowing that, and what it means to exercise transversal abilities in order to exercise autonomy. So that's why it's phrased in that way. Of course, what it does do is give you the option of converting other language like core skills and key competencies back into the language of transversal abilities. I mean, what this is it's a conceptual framework, and you can do alternative things with the concepts, and you can convert things in or out, and it's got the possibility of being flexible. I've got another question. Shall I just read it out?
Yeah, sure.
Right, from Jim. Thanks, Mark, for the paper. How transferable are transversal abilities, would you say? Are some more transferable than others? For example, evaluation. This can be difficult to transfer effectively with a change of occupation, although if occupations are within similar sector, it may be easier. Thanks, Jim. That's a very good question. And that ties back into expertise theory, which I've discussed elsewhere and not here. But Jim's right. To a certain expertise is relatively specific. And the more disparate things are, the harder it becomes to transfer expertise. But if you've got things that's been suggested that are relatively close, then you're going to have fewer problems with the transferable skills. So, for example, if we come back to the law example, if, for example, you've done a lot of one type of commercial law, it'll be relatively easy to transfer to another type of commercial law. But it's much more going to be much harder to become an expert in criminal law, and even harder to suddenly move over to that and be an expert in accounting. Okay, next question forward. I'm really interested in your mention of apprenticeships in the presentation. To what extent did you see transversal skills being developed in apprenticeships, and are there any strategies to improve this? I mean, unfortunately, the evidence from apprenticeships wasn't encouraging, and what we did seem to find is in a lot of cases, apprenticeships were being done in a box-ticking manner rather than attempt to develop transversal skills. And I think that was partly because a lot of the firms we interviewed simply didn't have coherent and well-organised training policies for their regular established staff, never mind their apprentices. So in terms of strategies to improve this, I would say you need to be heading with a sort of a top-down strategy, that you need an organised culture of training for your regular staff, and that has to be well embedded, well understood, well in place. And then you'll be in a position to propagate it down to apprenticeships. What I think the problem is if you suddenly start sticking apprenticeships into a culture where there's no established workplace training, there's a danger that you don't develop things like transversal skills very easily. And the other problem is for apprenticeships, a lot of apprenticeships are conceptualized in terms of a narrow definition of skills anyway, and that's another barrier we have to overcome. Comment from Jim. Thanks, Mark. It's a very important point. Discussion about transferability often glosses over the point that ease of transfer is a matter of degree. And I think thanks, Jim, for that. And I think what that points to is that there's important work between thinking about what we do around employer engagement and theoretical work in expertise that engages with psychology and learning. Because I think one of the problems that we get with improving workplace learning and apprenticeships is there's a tendency to see it all in economic terms and away from questions about learning and culture and psychology, which are actually pivotal to delivering it effectively. And the more we can build bridges between those areas, the better. From Ben Mitchell, what appetite is there amongst employers for greater employee autonomy? Leading question there. Now, that was a really interesting one because quite a few employers were not keen on that. And we found that a number of employers who initially engaged with us, when they found out how leading some of our questions were, they actually withdrew from wanting to participate in the project. And actually, I have to tell you, some of the worst offenders were some further education colleges, because as soon as they saw there were questions about employee autonomy, they really didn't want to know, which was quite interesting. So I think, again, we've got a lot of work to do there, because I think many employers, you know, including someone on our project, perceive workplace autonomy as a threat rather than a productivity tool. And a lot of that is related to the fact we have a command and control model in a lot of firms rather than one that's participatory in skill enhancing. And that, I think, reflects the fact that in the UK, we don't have an effective working social partnership model like we do in Germany. And I think if we did, we'd have far fewer issues about employer autonomy and far less employer concern about it.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Do we have any more questions?
Well, I'd just like to follow up that last question. What do you think should be done now, Mark? Given that we've got the present government extremely unlikely to introduce social partnership. So the German model, and we don't have that tradition. How can we get to these employers? That's the problem I see.
That's a conversation I've had over a few beers in the past when we were all still going out, and it's not an easy one. I mean, I think it's probably partly a piecemeal thing. One thing that trade unions can and should do is they should be trying to do more around social partnership and workplace learning, at least trying to push it. And what I think we should do is where and when we do have good contacts with employer organisations, you know, could be as high level as the CBI or things like more industry specific ones like the Federation of Printing Industries, to try and talk to them about the connections between autonomy, productivity, motivation, because this, like so many other change management problems, is a matter of changing perception and culture. I mean, I think when we're talking about any kind of change, it's very much about owning the problem to own the solution. And what we have to do is to start explaining what the problem is, that a lack of autonomy, a lack of training is connected with poor productivity, and get people to understand that and then try and move forward to the solution. I mean, I agree about the current government, but I have to say that I'm not so sure the Labour Party would be much better, because Chris and I repeatedly tried to engage the Labour Party in some of the work we were doing, and we kept it in a brick wall. So I think to a certain extent, it is a cross-party problem. And I suspect it's connected with the fact that so many MPs are university educated and have little or no contact with FE and vocational education. And as far as I know, that's true across all parties. And I suspect that is probably a more important factor than someone's political affiliation.
Okay, thank you for that. Any more questions to Mark? Okay, then.
Sorry, Sophia, just a quick final question. So I just wanted to ask Mark about the potential negatives of too much work or autonomy. Do you see any potential downsides to excessive?
I mean, I think it very much depends on the context. I mean, it's like, I mean, for example, one of the companies we had dealt with was a bus company. You know, obviously you can't have autonomy in the sense of people deciding when they're going to turn up on a route or not. I mean, that's going to be regulated. But one of the things, for example, would be allowing drivers, upskilling drivers a bit more autonomy, for example, to make routine repairs to their vehicles and things like that. So I think that's all part of a structured discussion in a business. And that comes back to what I said earlier, really, about trying to get proper training established with permanent staff in an organised way. And if at all possible, to involve employees so that everybody sees, so that people understand the limits of the autonomy and control in a way that they see it's helpful for the business and helpful for them. And it's about trying to get everybody on one side rather than the employer in one direction and the employees in another.
So thank you very much, Mark, for your presentation. That was super interesting. And now I would like to hand over to our next speaker, Stephen Sowa from the University of Edinburgh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Mark, for that presentation. So hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yes, thanks,
we
Stephen.
do.
Yeah. Okay. So today we're going to talk about the future of work, but in particular into relation to how primary school children are being equipped and some of their goals and aspirations with reference to the future of work. So as we've discussed in the conference so far, there's been many keynote speeches that have discussed how the landscape of work is changing based on automation and artificial intelligence. So this is looking at how we might best equip students, in particular primary school students, for the changing landscape of work. Okay, so as we've already discussed during the conference, some of the main advances in mobile robotics and machine learning are forecast to radically reshape the landscape of work. So in particular, automation of routine tasks has been historically quite prevalent. But what's being predicted is that also some non-routine manual and cognitive tasks could be subject to automation as well. So for example, some of these tasks could be reviewing legal documents or driving vehicles, tasks that range from cognitive to manual labor type work. And given this particular trend in not just routine, but also some non-routine work, it's becoming more and more difficult for pupils to understand what jobs could be available in the future and how they can be best prepared for this future. So some of the key skills that have been highlighted for the future have been discussed as well by Mark and others. In particular, skills such as creativity and social intelligence. These skills are much harder for machines to replicate, which is why it's predicted that those types of work that involve creative or social activities could be less subject to automation in the future. On the flip side, the work that involves manual labor is much more likely to be subject to automation in the next few decades. But also lower skill work or wage jobs, again, they're forecast to be subject to automation. So these sectors at most risk are forecast to be sectors such as production and transportation, construction, basic office and admin support work, as well as sales work. Having said all of that, there are many uncertainties regarding predicting job automation, as I'm sure most people are aware that understanding how labour markets will respond to changes and the implementation of technology is very complex, and many people have tried to come up with various models to predict the number of jobs that could be subject to automation or the number of tasks within particular occupations which could be subject to automation. So one of the problems is that some of these assessments by technology experts can be subject to certain biases and subjective assessments. So perhaps you're familiar with the famous paper by Frey and Osborne in 2013, which again incorporated technology experts' subjective assessments about the likelihood of around 800 occupations being at risk of automation. So to some extent, we're relying on the expertise of technology experts to determine what current technology could be used for with regard to work in the future, which has its own inherent uncertainties. But there's also the problem of predicting the technological adoption time lags. So there are multiple factors that will determine at what speeds the current technology, say in robotics or in artificial intelligence, how long they will take to be adopted by companies. So some of these economic variables that could be very difficult to predict could be the productivity gains from implementing various technologies, as well as legal and legislative barriers which could be put in place to limit the adoption of certain technologies. So that ultimately leads to an unknown number of jobs which could be created or lost to automation. So given this uncertainty, what should we conclude from the current research about the level and extent of job automation? Well, in my estimation, it's probably too difficult or too complex to come up with exact numbers regarding the number of jobs that will be created and lost due to automation. But that being said, we can see certain trends in terms of the types of work that could be more or less likely to be subject to automation. And given that knowledge, I think we certainly can start to devise education provisions which recognize those trends and help future learners understand those trends so they can make informed decisions about the types of jobs which could be more or less enriching and monetarily beneficial for them, as well as the jobs that could be more high risk if they took them on. So if we're in education provisions and we are helping to equip students for the future, we may want to give them the relevant information and decision-making skills to navigate the future of work, so they understand the risks and they can make informed, self-determined decisions. So what do I mean by occupational pursuit risks? So what I mean by this term is that given that there are certain trends that are taking place over the next few decades, and perhaps into the future more, we can help children and young people understand these likely risks in terms of the careers they wish to pursue and the sectors which could be more or less available for their penetration. What's really important is that these ongoing changes in the labour market and the implementation of new technologies are likely to coincide with key educational and career decision-making milestones. So children who are transitioning from primary to secondary school are making determinations about their subject choice and their activities outside of school settings. These are important decisions which have a significant influence over their career trajectories. So it's important that they're given the information from an early stage so they can make informed decisions about subject choices and extracurricular activities, so they're on the right pathway and setting the right goals for their future careers. Okay, so one of the most common ways to predict students' career pursuits and their eventual career attainment is their career aspirations. Although there are other variables that can be used, it's been shown that with regard to teenagers, their career aspirations are, or at least have been in the past, or relatively recent past, have been related with a fair degree of high correlation to their occupational attainment in, say, their 30s. There's been various studies on this, but some of them range from about 0.5 to 0.6 correlation, which again suggests that there's plenty of variation. These aren't perfect predictors, but they give a fair insight in terms of the types of jobs that children and young people are likely to pursue when they get to adolescence. And also their aspirations are related to subject and extracurricular and career-related activities. So they're not just related to the occupational attainment, but also other issues that are important in children's career development, such as subject choices and extracurricular activities. Having said that, as you go from secondary to primary school, children's aspirations become less stable and less predictable at the individual level. So if you were to try and predict a child who's in primary education, what their future career will be based on their career aspiration, it becomes far less stable and predictable at the individual level. But having said that, there are certain common trends and patterns that can be observed reliably when you look at the aggregate or the group level aspirational changes between primary and secondary school. So the differences between primary and secondary school students' career aspirations is actually fairly unsubstantial when you look at it in the aggregate. And in terms of changes, in terms of the type of aspiration held, again, they are largely predictable between primary and secondary school. So although at the individual level, aspirations become far less predictable at the primary level, at the group level or aggregate level, there are certain trends and patterns that can be observed. Okay. And so as part of this research I'm undertaking, I've recently completed a secondary data analysis. And this is just a brief overview of the methodology that was involved and some of the findings that we were able to obtain. So we're looking at, again, as we mentioned, we're looking at group differences in terms of occupational pursuit risks. So these will be children's and young people's career aspirations relative to certain probabilities of jobs being subject to automation. So this secondary data analysis involved UK and international data. The survey data was around 11,800 primary school pupils' aspirations and over 7,000 international respondents across 20 countries. And we also had large survey data at the secondary school level of 10,000 secondary school pupils. Again, we used these career aspiration data relative to probabilities of automation of 800 occupations. And using this secondary data, we conducted an ANOVA and looked at average group proportions and country means, standard deviation and correlations. So what did we find from this study? We found that mostly primary and secondary school students are pursuing lower risk careers. So at the secondary level, the age of 7, roughly around 10% of respondents suggested they were looking to pursue careers in jobs that will be highly subject to automation. However, as you get into the older age groups, when children's and young people's aspirations start to diverse more into sectors which move away from social or creative work, and you start to see a larger percentage of children and young people adopting higher risk aspirations, so up to 25% by the time they get to the end of secondary school. And so in particular, children, as is fairly common, they have career interests and career aspirations in sectors such as sport and art and entertainment and education and healthcare. These sectors, as I mentioned, are at lower risk of automation. But we were particularly concerned with differences across groups. So we noticed that there were reliable and statistically significant differences across gender and socioeconomic status and ethnicity as well. But also there was findings which suggest that if a child had a parent who was holding an occupation at high risk of automation, the child was also likely or more likely to be pursuing a similar occupation. So the influence of parents on children and their career pursuits could be an important consideration for education providers when they're looking to target particular vulnerable groups who could be more likely to pursue jobs that could be subject to automation. I have about 5 minutes, is that right? Okay, so I'll move on to the next slide. So one of the most definitive findings was gender risk disparities. So there's quite a common and robust finding in the literature on career aspirations that on average, there tends to be a difference in male career aspirations tending towards careers involving objects or things, whereas girls and young women, they tend to, on average, pursue or express an aspiration for occupations involving people, so in social sectors in particular. Having said that, creative roles, there's more of a gender balance. So male and female respondents suggested a similar level of interest in creative roles. As has been well documented, there's differences in STEM preferences. But also there's various other psychological factors to consider when we're trying to understand differences in gender with regard to the careers they could pursue. There is some data which suggests that outcome expectations, so the reasoning behind a child wanting to obtain a particular occupation, so whether it could be motivated by status or by fulfillment or whatever the motive could be, there are some findings which suggest that gender differences, such as an average difference in men wanting to pursue more higher status, higher paying jobs than women, that could act as a counterbalance to the other findings. But given that also women and young girls are actually on average outperforming boys in terms of educational attainment, that also could lead perhaps girls and young women to pursue more higher status roles. So it's a complex mix of psychological and social factors which are forcing girls and young boys into different directions regarding the types of jobs they're pursuing. But nevertheless, we did see a difference, particularly motivated by the people versus things factor, which means that on average, young boys are more likely to pursue higher risk jobs in particularly manual labor roles. Also, there was differences in terms of socioeconomic groups. So we're able to use free school meals as a proxy for socioeconomic status across the sample. And we noticed that lower socioeconomic groups tended to more likely pursue occupations that were lower wage or lower skill, such as an administrator or a trade position. But these differences were fairly small at the primary school level. And as I mentioned before, pupils who, with a parent holding a desired career, are more likely to hold a high-risk aspiration. So the influence of parents over children's occupational pursuits could be something we really need to take into account when trying to equip students with the right knowledge and skills for the future. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the trend from primary to secondary school is a proportional increase in higher risk aspirations. This trend is partly due to children's shift from more historically unrealistic careers to more realistic careers, such as moving away from sports to careers in well, it could be an office setting or in STEM, for example. And also their increasing knowledge of conventional careers. So again, moving away from fantasy related careers or very unrealistic careers to more conventional careers as they get older. So what can we do to prepare students for the future of work? So this will be a good opportunity for me to get some feedback from you all, to hear some of your suggestions, but also I just wanted to propose a few ideas myself and get your feedback. So what I would like to propose is that careers education has historically taken place at the secondary school level or higher. There is now increasing emphasis on having careers education and careers interventions at the primary school age. I would suggest this is a very important step to take, given that there's a key transition point in children's aspiration formation between primary and secondary. We know that the change in the aggregate isn't substantial between primary and secondary. So we need to ideally start helping students form relevant knowledge about how the future of work is changing, what are realistic and less realistic occupational pursuits, and to give them the information and adaptability skills and understanding of social forces which could shape their career aspirations. So given that adequate preparation, it could be a really important time in their education to equip them to start to form not definitive career aspirations. While one shouldn't impose that on children, but they should be at least mindful of how the future is changing and how their aspirations can start to be cemented by the time they get into secondary school. Yeah, and in terms of the average differences across groups, again, these are just average differences. They don't reflect individual choices. So if you looked at an individual female boy or girl, you couldn't necessarily predict their eventual occupation. But these group differences are potentially a useful heuristic for teachers. If you're working in a classroom with, say, a large proportion of boys or girls, you know that there's a higher likelihood that they'll have certain career aspirations. And it can be incumbent upon the teacher to tailor their educational provision based on the audience. So it's a useful heuristic, but it shouldn't be used as a all-encompassing solution. So just quickly to end, because I know I'm going past my time. So what should we be preparing students for? Should we be preparing them for an unpredictable future, which has a range of generic skills? And again, we've discussed some of these skills such as metacognition, collaboration, critical thinking, digital literacy. Certainly these skills are very important. They will be very important in the future. But what I'd like to propose is that although we can't be certain about specific aspects of the future labour markets, we can say there'll be certain types of work that will be more common. And given we understand some of these trends, I think it's important that we help to equip students with this understanding and so that they can make informed decisions themselves about the careers that they would like to pursue, recognising the risks involved. And one of the key findings from psychology is that in order to make good use of these, say, decision-making skills or general skills such as problem solving, it's really important that they're equipped with the domain-specific knowledge. For example, in careers, if they have that knowledge about how careers are changing, what careers entail, what are various aspects of different careers, and then they can make informed decisions about their career pathways and be well equipped for the future of work. So, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, for your interesting presentation. Yeah, you already said a few implications or what we can do. I'm also interested what the others think about it. So if you have questions or comments, you can, oh, I see Jim has something written in the chat. Of course, you're also welcome to switch on your camera and your microphone if you want to yeah, ask your question, Jim. Otherwise, we can also read it, what suits you the best. Yeah, hi, Jim, I can see you already. You just want to ask it on your own?
Just looking for the first question.
Yeah, I've sort of lost the chat, unfortunately, Sophia. Sorry, yeah, for some reason it's disappeared from my screen. Oh, there it is. It's come back again. Okay, well, I can read out my question, no problem. Yeah, well, thanks very much, Stephen, for this very interesting presentation. I was kind of interested in whether you see any tension between those jobs at risk from automation and some of the immediate skills shortage in the economy, particularly in the short term. And I just wondered if this might give rise to some kind of difficulties when discussing career opportunities and career aspirations with children and their parents. So, I mean, we get quite a lot of stuff in the media and sometimes from the government about sort of skill shortages and occupations that, you know, we need people to move into. Construction, for example, is one example where we're seeing now some big skills shortages in some areas. So is there a bit of an issue here with how you go about discussing some of this with children and their parents when they can see actually, you know, maybe it might be a good idea in the short term to try and get a job in construction?
Yeah, that's a very good point to raise, actually, because we're talking about short-term and long-term trends, and it's quite difficult for not just children, but human beings to understand the differences between short-term and long-term changes. So as you say, in certain sectors such as construction, there may be skill shortage, or a shortage of numbers, which you can certainly should be part of the discussion that children are exposed to. So if a child has a passion for construction and in the short term, there's plenty of opportunities for them to pursue that, certainly they should be made aware of that. But then a career is not simply manifest in the short term, it manifests over a long term. So yes, that is part of the picture that one should paint for the students, but also we want to show them that the longer term trends, at least they suggest that jobs in construction and production over the long term are likely to diminish. We can discuss about how quickly that will happen, but at least it will spark a conversation in the classroom about what's a good strategy for your career. Should it be pursuing a career for a certain sector and then trying to transition to other sectors, or should it be about looking at longer term trends and trying to make your way into a sector that could have long-term longevity? So you're completely right that we need to have a nuanced discussion about this, and it shouldn't just be let's just pursue social and creative work, because that's too simplistic.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, here in the chat are some more questions for you. For example, Louis is asking, you wonder what impact other trends like political, social, and environmental will have on young people alongside the challenging issue of automation and AI. And if you came across with that in your research.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So this is one of the problems when you look at the future, because there are so many different factors that could play out and impact not just labor markets, but the way we live and interact with one another. So trends such as ecological changes and social and political, they're extremely, well, ecological are more easy to predict, but social and political, obviously even harder to predict than just changes in the labor market, arguably. So yes, certainly when students are thinking about the future, they can certainly be discussing those social and political issues and how they interact with economies and how they shape the job landscape. But yeah, I suppose I don't want to suggest that I have the solution, but I wouldn't necessarily say that going too in depth into all of the multivariate factors that shape the future would be entirely helpful for a young child who's trying to understand what's plausible about the future. I think it's very difficult to impose a vision of the future on students, and we should be careful about doing so. But at the same time, education is founded on a vision of the future. When we educate children, we make presumptions that the future will be a certain way. So if we believe that in the future that skills such as problem solving and digital literacy will be important, it's because we have a conception of the future. When we educate students, we have a preconception of the future. We can't avoid that. So we have to just give them the relevant information and try to help them understand what's more realistic than other scenarios. But certainly political and social can be part of the discussion, and should be.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the time is almost over. So there were a question if you could share your secondary sources, maybe you have cited, and also from which data set you used. Maybe you can just answer that in the chat later or on the online platform of the conference.
Yeah,
maybe
sure.
it's possible for you. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, so now it's the time for the last presentation from Graham and me. Let me share my screen. Okay. So yeah, welcome again from my side, and welcome to our presentation on preparation of learners, teachers, and trainers in the age of artificial intelligence. My name is Sophia, and I'm giving this presentation together with Graham Attwell. Graham Attwell is the director of Pondudisco, and that Pondudisco is a research and development organization based in Wales, Germany, and Spain. And Graham, if I can say it for you, your research interest includes, among other things, the development in the labor market and the uses of technology for knowledge sharing, teaching, and training. I am working as a research assistant at the University of Bremen at the Institute Technology and Education. And as a political scientist, I am interested mostly in the sociocultural and political issues that arise in the context of digital transformation. Graham and I, we are working currently together with partners from Italy, Greece, and Lithuania in a project called Tackle AI. So it's about artificial intelligence. But artificial intelligence is not a new topic that has been occupying computer science since the early 1950s. But in the last years, it has been high on the agenda because of technological advances and the availability of data and more powerful computers that push the limits of what machines can do. So the main question in our research project is, what impact will artificial intelligence have on vocational education and training in Europe? And what does it mean for teachers and trainers? So to approach this question, we did a lot of literature reviews. We interviewed teachers and stakeholders about AI and vocational education and training. And we also looked for examples of implementation in practice. So how AI is influencing that already. And besides that, we also conducted an online survey, at least in Germany, among vocational school teachers, to get at least a first picture on how vocational schools are already responding to changes in the world of work today, and which role artificial intelligence and automation will take in the future. Okay, so first of all, one fundamental result of our literature review at the beginning was that we have to distinguish two dimensions in which vocational education and training is influenced by artificial intelligence. So on the one hand, we have the dimension that for artificial intelligence. Yeah, we already heard a lot about it because through the increased use of artificial intelligence technologies, industries, business, medicine, and a lot of other fields, occupations are changing. So that tasks previously performed by humans can now potentially be taken over or assisted by computers and computer-controlled machines. Stephen already said a lot about that before. So vocational education is under enormous pressure to adapt in order to train competent workers for these changing works of world. So that includes that in some cases, new skills and qualifications are needed. But, and that is really important, in addition, there's a need to promote the non-technological areas of action and strength of the learners. For example, as we also heard before, empathy, creativity, critical thinking. So the task of that institutions is not only to prepare for changing work tasks, learners should also be able to take part in the shaping and the use of AI technology. So finally, we call this dimension preparation for an AI-based world of work. That's the first dimension. The other dimension called artificial intelligence in vocational education and training. So AI-based technologies affect educational institutions on different levels. Here I chose the differentiation by the UNESCO. They distinguish 3 levels. So AI tools could be used for education management and delivery, also for learning and assessment. This dimension got the most, were most people talking about, like using intelligent tutoring systems. And artificial intelligence tools can be also used for empowering teachers and enhancing teaching. We will not have the time to discuss this dimension more deeply, even if it's super interesting, but we can summarize that the potential of AI in education is quite high, but there are also really high risks concerning ethical and pedagogical issues. So just because something is technically feasible, and there's a lot that is technically feasible, does not mean that this innovation is also an advance for pedagogical practice or ethically right. So there are still a lot of issues we have to discuss, and both dimensions or perspectives raise a lot of questions. Today, we want to focus on that dimension, that for artificial intelligence. So that includes preparation for an AI-based world of work, and that includes the preparation of the learners, but also the preparation of teachers and trainers for these tasks. So let me start with the preparation of learners. I will present some insights from our German research in this project, and after that, I will hand over to Graham. Okay, as I mentioned before, we had conducted an online survey among vocational school teachers in Germany. And in our survey, we asked vocational school teachers if they have any ideas on how to modernize the school curriculum or to respond in school to the introduction of AI or automation in work processes. So the answers could be divided into mainly 3 categories. Some teachers had concrete ideas about content for the curriculum, like offering deep learning as a compositive elective subject or something. Others referred to more general conditions, something like training for teachers. And others answered that new designed learning venues are necessary. And on the one hand, they asked for better cooperation between school, companies, and AI developers. And on the other hand, they also ask for different and innovative didactical approaches. In addition to that survey, we also interviewed some teachers more deeply to get more insights. And also in that interviews, many of them asked for more cooperation with companies and for joint projects to prepare the learners for their working life. The teachers also stated that working in project is very important for young people because that project work promotes their social skills like collaborative working, and that will be even more important in the future. But the question is, how could this cooperation between schools and companies look like in practice? And one inspiring cooperation example we want to present you today in the next slide. It is the Smart Factory project at the vocational school in Wolfsburg. At the vocational school in Wolfsburg, a modern teaching concept for vocational training of automation and mechatronics technicians was developed. And teachers from the school worked together with partners from the Volkswagen automobile factory. It's in the same city. And the core concept is a smart filling line. You can see a model here on the picture. And trainees for automation technology and dual students have developed and built this compact smart factory filling system themselves. So the special thing is that it works with the same technical components as a production plant in industry. So that's how learners should get familiar with the latest Industry 4.0 technologies directly in school, so they are prepared for their working life after. And the special didactical approach is that they chose a deductive teaching approach to introduce learners to the new technologies, which are incorporated in this smart filling model. So that means the training begins with a digital overall system. And that serves as a model professional action. So based on this filling line, individual components can be understood. And through this approach, the learners get a holistic understanding of Industry 4.0 processes, not only individual components, so the whole model. And to support the young people's independent learning, they also establish a digital learning platform. Right now, during the COVID times, it gets more usual to have digital learning platforms in schools, but before it was quite rare, to be honest. So they have this learning platform, and this is for learning, self-learning for the students, but also for connecting between cooperation, the school and industry partners. And the experience with this teaching and learning concept was very positive so far. And I guess this example shows is one example of how action and process-oriented teaching and learning could look like, and how competencies of that schools and also industry partners. So the one are giving didactical and pedagogical insights, and the industry is giving what they are using right now in the factory, to combine and to prepare learners for the ever faster changing working environments. Of course, that was just a really short overview of that project. If you want to know more, you can have a look on our project website of Tackle AI that is described in more depth, and you can see a video of that project. That's it from my side. Now I hand over to Graham.
First, unmute myself, it would probably help. I think there's quite a strong link between all the three projects today, actually, because very much we've been looking at the future of work in some detail through this project. And I've been doing some work on developing an AI-powered chatbot, actually, around labour market information. And I do think one of the things that's going to have to happen if we're going to deal with preparing learners for the future AI-powered AI in the workforce, and if we're going to adapt to changes in the tasks in jobs, because I think more than jobs disappearing and new jobs coming in, the biggest change is going to be the tasks within jobs, and I think that's being ignored a bit too much at the moment. Then we need to combine both working together with developers, AI developers, with industries and education together, because they've all got a role to play in that. And secondly, I think we need to use far more labour market information for colleges to get an understanding, not just of the big mega trends, but it's very apparent to me working with LMI that there is big differences at local levels, certainly at regional and at local levels as well. So those things need to be done. But here's just an example again. This is just an example approach in the UK, where there are growing skills shortages in a new area, very much driven by digitalization, which is the area of data scientists, which means their pay rates going up very high, which is probably good for them. But we do have new apprenticeship standards at pre-degree and degree level now. And I'm quite interested in the industry group. What's more, if we're coming on to that whole idea mind of the autonomy of work, which I think is a critical other phase in this, because in Germany, I think there is generally far more attention being paid to autonomous work, and partly because of the social partnership involved. Whilst here we note there was no trade unions on this list, no social partners on this list. And I was quite interested to see that AstraZeneca was in there alongside the Office of National Statistics. And at the same time, they're pushing for an expansion of university programs in data science, an extension of AI within computer science degrees. Although once more, I wonder how practically orientated that will be and how much it will be at a theoretical level. So we've seen two different examples from two different countries, and we have examples from other countries as well if you go to our website. So next slide, please, because I've got 5 minutes left. So just looking, what does this mean for teachers and trainers? And if we are right in thinking that AI is going to have the effects we think it's going to have on future tasks in initial vocational education and training, on learning about the impact of AI, and very much that word where we say shaping, it's a bad translation of the German word gestaltung, which means their ability to actually co-design the work process, coming back to that whole thing about autonomy in the work process. Then teachers and trainers have to have an understanding. Now, one of the things I think was interesting from the survey that Sophia introduced is I rather thought that there would be a lot of opposition from teachers and trainers in Germany to AI. In general, Germany has a greater sense of data privacy than in the UK, but it wasn't so. The teachers and trainers were generally interested and generally wanted to find out more and wanted to use it. So next slide, please. But that does mean, but also said they wanted professional development, clearly. And it's on two levels. I think one is how we can scale opportunities for continuing professional development, because in my experience, it's not going to be done the traditional way. We've struggled for years with getting teachers and trainers even to use technology as a whole. And probably we've made 5 years progress in the last year. We've jumped 5 years, even if I fear that it's online teaching. We've actually mainly developed online learning. I think we've still got a long way to go. And part of that whole thing is providing examples of effective practice. And that's what I get asked most. This is my second presentation today. I did a keynote presentation to 150 teachers and trainers and managers in Catalonia 2 hours before. And this came big with them. They were asking me, how we like this idea, we want to get involved. How can we get involved? How can we find examples? Very good 40 minutes of questions. Next slide, please. Okay, so we need some pedagogic framework to designing online professional development. And here is my 4 suggestions on which that pedagogic framework might be. We are looking at massive open online courses, but that's not the only answer. And they don't perhaps have to be so massive as we once thought they had to be. We're not looking at 25,000 students, but we are looking at something that scales. If we've got people who want to come in, it scales. We're looking at flexibility in how teachers and trainers can access it. Lots of people said to us, I can't turn up every Thursday at 1 o'clock because we've got staff meetings then, we've got departmental meetings, I'm teaching at that time, but I'd be interested in getting involved. And I think part of that flexibility is also to pick and choose, if you haven't got much time, what parts you want to learn about. Are you more interested in changing world of work? Are you more interested in pedagogic use or examples of the use of AI? We need open educational resources that can be transferred between countries. And I was certainly talking to my Catalan colleagues this morning about would they be prepared to get involved in producing Spanish open education resources from the resources we are producing in German and English. And building communities is obviously key to it. And I know I'm running out of time, so let's go to the next slide. And so September 2021, be part of it. We are running such a massive open online course. It will be open for the rest of the year. You don't have to start on that date. You can enroll for it on Eventbrite, but you can go to our website to find a link to Eventbrite because I haven't got the link now to hand. We've produced 5 different modules. We think each takes about a week, but it depends how much depth you go into them. About 4 or 5 hours, I guess, each one. So we've got that AI automation and vet, the future of work, yes, AI teaching and learning vet, curriculum and skills needed for vocational teachers and trainers, and of course AI and ethics, which is a big issue in itself. And on to the next, all the notes Sophia's put in the chat where you can enroll for it on. Go to the, and it's free, of course. And if you go to the next slide, I think it's our last slide. No, there are some discussion issues I've put there. But you're free to ask your own questions. I mean, yes, you're perfectly free to. And thank you very much for inviting us. And thank you very much for listening to us today. That's it, folks.
Okay, so of course, if you have questions on our work, our presentation, you're welcome to do that now. And we are also, of course, welcoming you to our MOOC if you're interested.
I had a comment as much as a question. I mean, the issues Graham raised about scalability and flexibility. I mean, we've been having very similar discussions at the OU around professional learning and the tailoring of professional learning. So it strikes me that that's something that's becoming an increasing concern to anyone who's involved in online and distance education.
The distinction between online teaching and online learning. I'm sorry, my sound quality is a little poor here. But I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah.
Well, I think that there's, I mean, basically, I think the issue is that a lot of the activities undertaken with relation to COVID-19 were people using platforms like Zoom, but increasingly Microsoft Teams as well, to deliver what we might basically call online lectures or online lessons. But I think there's a lot more creative way that technology can be used for people, or for instance, for groups working together, undertaking projects together for learning, and also more action in that learning. And I don't think, I think quite understandable that people who were basically given 48 hours to deliver their lessons online followed that basic lesson plan before, but now I think it's going deeper. But of course, it's not quite clear what's going to happen now. I suspect that at least in HE, we're going to move to blended learning. I'm not quite so sure what will happen in schools and in vocational learning, but I think there will be probably blended learning and vocational as well.
Thank you, Graham. We also got a question from Stephen. He's asking, what are current levels of understanding of AI among our target audiences? I could just say for our German context, it was quite different. We interviewed a lot of teachers from the technical area, and they had quite a good understanding of AI and also could differentiate between strong and weak AI, and had quite a good understanding. And there were also people who had never really heard about AI or just use it in their phones, but do not really know what exactly AI is. And I mean, there is also not a clear definition of AI, so that will also be part of our MOOC to discuss that. So that's it from my side. Graham, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, I thought JISC had quite a realistic publication they brought out, I think March or April around this, where they said we're very much at the early adaptive stage at the moment within FE. So you've got some fabulous examples of some projects going on, Bolton College with their Ada chatbot, where that project, the Ada project, has scaled to the extent that you've got general awareness of the use of AI across most of the staff in the college. You've got others, for instance, Basingstoke College of Technology, which is using Century Plus, is it? They're using technology for teaching. Language learners, language teachers, they seem to have a very high knowledge, probably because of the influence of Duolingo as the biggest learning program in the world, and very much an AI-driven program. In others, no real awareness at all. So I think it's varied. I do think it's important that staff understand what's happening, even if they don't want to use the stuff themselves, but it's going to have such a big influence on the future of work. And I think having a basic knowledge around AI is important.
We got an interesting question from Ollie. What's the biggest myth about AI you'd like to bust? Do you have something, Graham?
Sorry, what was the question?
What's the biggest myth, I don't know how to pronounce it in English, about AI you'd like to bust?
Biggest myth? I think probably the myth of two, I'm going to say two. One's related to careers. This myth that 65% of jobs in the futures will be done by, that people at school today, 65% of their jobs in the future are jobs that do not exist now. It's a total, to be colloquial, load of bollocks. It's not based on research at all. It was based on one newspaper article somewhere, which then got the amplifying effect of media. And now it seems to be quoted by people who shouldn't be quoting it. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but there's no research behind it. The second one, I think, it's not so much a myth. Well, yeah, it is a myth once more. the lack of understanding that AI is not really a robot. And the one I'd like them to get is the difference between narrow AI and general AI. It's a good question.
Yeah, I think so too. And your last statement is also what I would have answered. It's not about robots. And then we got a question from Ben. I think it's for all of us. 3 very interesting presentations. Thank you. This may be beyond the scope of this session, but I wonder if you have considered the impact of your research and findings on non-vocational education and training, however that might be defined. So yes, Stephen, Mark, Graham, what do you think?
Well, I'll say 2 things. Firstly, I'm quite impressed with the Finnish course where they put they've got an online course for citizens as a whole. Although I think it's a little too technically biased, I think it's what Finns are saying, and that's been translated into all European languages, is that everybody should have some understanding of this, regardless of whether it's going to affect their work or not. And then secondly, well, yes, of course, because we are looking at the use of AI for teaching and learning, which applies as much to non-vocational as it does to vocational. The future work side is obviously vocational.
Mark, I see that you also unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, I take it that my work has got clear applications to non-vocational learning. I mean, anything to do with expertise does. But I mean, in particular with the paper, when you're thinking about autonomy and transversal skills, those very much do apply to non-vocational learning. Because I mean, if you want to be an effective learner in a non-vocational context, you are going to have to plan and organise and judge and evaluate and communicate effectively and do all of those things. And I would say that if you look at non-vocational degrees that are effective in terms of giving people jobs, what those non-vocational degrees give you is the transversal skills as well as the subject content.
Okay, I guess that's about it.
Yeah, I do think so too. So Ollie already said thank you in the chat. Thanks also from my side for your questions, and all the presentations. It was really interesting. And I guess we have the contact possibly through the Vonova app. So if you want to get in contact or visit our websites, you are well, more than welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye all.